we've forgotten the basics of spirituality, which is that it's a communication and a conversation with God.
And I'm convinced when I was in the light, that communication, that talking with God was probably the most important. It's just a feeling you can never ever forget.
And then obviously each person's going to have that conversation in a little bit of a different way.
Where I was up there in the light, in a familiar place. I was home.
If I had my choice, I would have stayed.
I try to go around loving people today.
When you go to the other side, you understand first this: you're a great and powerful spiritual being.
It's not all over with the death of the brain and the body. Some aspect of us is divine.
Hello, I'm Joseph Campanella. All the people you've just heard from have had their lives permanently altered by visions of what lies beyond this reality. Many have been positively changed by a near-death experience. The near-death experience, or NDE as it's come to be known, is common knowledge in the 90s. And no, this program isn't simply another treatise on the near-death experience. No, we're going to take you far beyond that. An estimated 8 million Americans have had near-death experiences, and many of them tell of having had personal encounters with divine beings as a result of their brush with death. And these encounters, these conversations with God, have had amazing transformational effects on the lives of these people. But first, let's lay the groundwork. All those who have had a brush with death tell a very similar story.
People from all over the world who come close to death as a result of a cardiac arrest or other illness will report to us a common pattern of experience.
This is Dr. Raymond Moody, noted psychiatrist, lecturer, and researcher. He is perhaps best known as the author of the groundbreaking examination of the near-death experience, the best-selling book, Life After Life. It has sold upwards of 15 million copies and has been printed in 14 different languages.
They tell us, first of all, that they seem, from their point of view, to leave their physical bodies, to float up above the scene of the resuscitation, and to watch the events going on down below. They tell us that they go through a narrow passageway or a tunnel into an incredibly brilliant and warm and loving light. And they say that as they go into this light, they are met by the spirits of relatives or friends of theirs who have already died. They tell us that they may meet a being they describe as a being of light, a wise and loving presence who conducts them through a panoramic memory review in which they seem to see every single detail of their life displayed around them in full colors and 3 dimensions, and that as this progresses, they learn that the most important thing they could have done with this life they had just led is to learn how to love their fellow human beings.
Thanks to modern medicine, people are being brought back from death's door. And we're learning about these wonderful lessons of hope and love. Hamlet, in his famous To Be or Not to Be soliloquy, spoke of that undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveler ever returns. Of course, that undiscovered country he spoke of was death, and he feared that if he took his own life, he would fly to ills that we know not of. Well, Shakespeare had a great insight into the human condition, but in his 17th century world, he was lacking information that we have today 400 years later. Travelers do return from that undiscovered country, and we are not flying to ills we know not of. Travelers to that new land return with a new outlook on life, and the cumulative effect of this new knowledge is usually a dramatic, positive life transformation.
I think that what we can get out of near-death experiences without having to think of it in terms of a proof of a life after death is that it has enormous spiritual value. And we can see very dramatically the transformations in personality that it can bring about among people who go through something like this.
Two other authors who can attest to this are Paul Perry, co-author of 6 books on the near-death experience, and Danyan Brinkley, who suffered not just 1, but 2 brushes with death. His best-selling books are the result of these life-altering events.
You know, I think one of the most amazing things about the near-death experience is how virtually everyone who has it no longer has a fear of death. I mean, if you look at Melvin Morris's research in the transformation study, he found that almost 100% of people who almost die and have the near-death experience are no longer afraid of death.
As far as approaching death, I have no fear of dying whatsoever.
I'm not afraid to leave this world because I have been where I'm going again.
I do not look forward to the dying process. I do acknowledge the fact that it was painful and that I did get frightened. But I do know that all of that is just a passageway into this experience that I had before.
This is Diane Morrissey. Diane is a group leader for a Los Angeles chapter of IANDS, the International Association for Near-Death Studies. These are people who have visited that passageway. They meet on a monthly basis to share their experiences and help others understand the life transformational impact of an NDE.
My son was killed in a car accident, and it was a very violent death. He went off a freeway. He went down 65 feet into cement, and so the fear I had of the pain he endured, and for the hour and a half that took them to get him out of the vehicle, haunted me. It just haunted me. When I first read Life After Life with Dr. Raymond Moody, that gave me my first glimpse of life after death, and it gave me my first hope.
Quite a number of people over the years have told me that in the closing moments of their life that they were surrounded by helping presences, beings that you could characterize, I suppose, as angels.
And I belong to a group called Compassionate Friends, and we have a thing called Day of Hope. And we just had our 3rd one, and Diane was our speaker, and Grace Boboka has been a speaker.
I just wanted to tell them, do what you have to do. I'm okay, because I was out of my pain. All of that pain, all of that suffering was completely gone.
Nothing I've heard from my religious background, nothing I've read, no other things have helped but that. That was the single most significant thing that has happened. And it has transformed my entire life. And my whole outlook on life is different.
So it changed my whole life. It changed my career. It changed what I believe in. It taught me that everything we think, do, and say is extremely important, much more than we ever thought before, no matter how religious we were.
One of the most dramatic, complete, and profound life-altering near-death experiences is that of Danyan Brinkley, author of Saved by the Light. He was electrocuted when lightning struck a telephone line outside his home.
On September 17th at 7:05 p.m. in 1975, I was talking on the telephone to a friend of mine.
All right, Tommy, thanks a lot for inviting us. I have to check with Sandy, though, because you know she manages my time for me. Well, this is some storm we're having, huh? All right, well, anyway, thanks for inviting us.
I was on fire like I had been consuming battery acid. I was burning. I didn't know what had happened to me. Then all of a sudden, it was as though I was floating. And then I rolled over and I saw my wife coming down the hall.
Oh, Danny! Oh, Danny, what happened? Oh, my God! I need some help.
I didn't know what had happened to me. I had never heard of the near-death experience. And I didn't know if I was at ground zero or what had happened. The guy who I was talking to on the other end of the phone came over immediately. He was a corpsman in the Navy, and he knew I was dead.
Call an ambulance. Okay, well, but don't leave him. Don't leave him. Okay, I'll go.
I'm watching him watch me. I'm watching him be emotional, wondering, you know, here is his friend and what's happening, and I can hear his thoughts. And I remember looking over his shoulder and looking down at myself and thinking that I thought I was a better looking guy than that.
Check his vital signs. He's gone.
Then this tunnel began to form. As this tunnel began to form, I felt more at peace than I'd ever felt. I felt comfortable and safe. I began to be pulled down this tunnel. And as I moved down it, I become so secure that I may not know exactly what's going on, but I know that this is right and natural.
But there are some who say that it's not right or natural or even real for that matter. There's one school of thought that holds the opinion that these visions are mental tricks caused by a dying, short-circuiting brain, or even that they're caused by drugs. But scientists who've devoted years to researching these experiences disagree.
For anyone to say that these near-death experiences can be explained away as the terminal events in the brain, biochemical disturbances, or wish-fulfilling fantasies, or whatever, is just as unreasonable as if someone were to come along and say that these near-death experiences prove scientifically that there is a life after death.
People, I think, are familiar with the fact that we actually have two brains. We have a right brain that controls basically the left side of our body, a left brain that controls the right side of our body.
Dr. Melvin Morse is a practicing physician and associate professor of pediatrics at the University of Washington. He has written the best-selling books Closer to the Light, which spent 3 months on the New York Times bestseller list, Transformed by the Light, and Parting Visions, all based on his interviews with child patients who have died and come back.
Deep within our brain, on the right side, right above the ear, and deep, deep, deep within the brain, is an area which allows us to communicate with, for lack of a better word, with God. And that is the part of the brain which allows us to have an inner voice, that allows us to have a sense of conscience. It's the quiet part, the nonverbal, intuitive side that every human being has.
These studies have not been taught in medical schools. They're out there for anyone to look at, and I challenge people to look at this data and assess it for themselves. And I believe that if people will look at this data, this can show positive effects of mind at a distance. And to me, this represents a friendly, benevolent side to the universe.
Dr. Larry Darcy, an internist who has studied the effect prayer has in the healing process. He is the author of Meaning and Medicine and Healing Words, The Power of Prayer in Medicine.
There are now well over 130 controlled laboratory studies testing this ability of prayer to act positively at a distance, and over half of these studies show statistical significance that when I pray for you, and I have a loving, empathic, and compassionate attitude toward you, then you change for the better.
So we see that this right temporal lobe has many functions in our body. Some viewers may not be aware that telepathy, for example, is a well-established fact, has been documented in the laboratory again and again, and is mediated by our right temporal lobe.
In one of the best human studies, we saw a cardiologist at the University of California Medical School at San Francisco perform this study in the coronary care unit at San Francisco General Hospital. Dr. Randolph Bird looked at 393 patients who either had an acute heart attack or severe chest pain. All of these people got admitted to the coronary care unit and were given state-of-the-art, high-tech coronary care. Half of these people, however, had their first names farmed out to various prayer groups in the San Francisco Bay Area, and half did not. This was what we call a double-blind study. Neither the patients nor the healthcare team, the doctors, nurses, and so on, knew who was and wasn't being prayed for. When the data were analyzed and the numbers were all assessed, It looked as if this prayed-for group had been given some sort of miracle medication.
Well, now this gives us more of a physiological explanation for telepathy, because this same area of the brain, which allows us to mediate these subtle electromagnetic forces, can then reach out at a long distance to someone else's electromagnetic field.
There were fewer deaths in the prayed-for group. The prayed-for group required fewer potent drugs, such as antibiotics and diuretics.
we can stop thinking of these things as weird or bizarre or paranormal. We understand that we're biologically equipped to have things like miracles happen to us.
I can assure you, if what was being evaluated here had not been prayer, but some sort of new medication to be used for acute heart attacks, this would have been heralded as a modern medical breakthrough, and people would probably have been lined up down the street to get their hands on this stuff.
So for the first time, we have a scientific understanding of the nature of God, and it is a miracle. And the fact that neuroscientists are starting to understand it does not devalue it in any way. It makes it more accessible. It says to people who are struggling with their own spiritual feelings and intuitions, yes, you are right. You are not just a biological machine. You're a biological machine with something extra. Something, for lack of a better word, that has a soul.
Modern science is implying that we have shared characteristics with the divine. You know, that's pretty good for me.
That's pretty good for most of us. And for those who have come back to tell about it, the journey the soul takes at that moment of death is full of wonder, comfort, and more than anything else, love.
It was very dark at first, but it was beautiful.
This is Grace Babulka. Her near-death experience compelled her to share her experience with others in her book, Beyond This Reality. She also speaks regularly at churches and for support groups.
To me, it was beautiful. It had all kinds of color and sound, and a feeling that I wasn't alone. I was being helped through this darkness towards a brightness that was up ahead that I was incredibly drawn towards. I wanted to be towards that light. I wanted to go towards that light. And at the same time, I was being drawn. I was being attracted. And I was being helped.
People don't describe beings with wings, but illuminated beings who seem to be there in the role of a helper, someone there to guide them through this experience. And so in that sense, I would say definitely that what has been called in the religious tradition for a long time guardian angels do seem to be a reality to people who are at the moment of death.
And what was unusual is I went back and forth through the tunnel several times, and I'd come back and see what's happening, and then I'd go back through the tunnel again. And each time I did, I kind of felt somebody there waiting for me.
And I think the best thing that I learned out of this is that the actual moment of dying is the greatest trip you're ever going to go on. It's a fascinating, wonderful trip.
Many of these journeys begin in a hospital, in an emergency room or operating theater. Such was the case for Grace Babulka, herself a registered nurse and working associate of those who frantically tried to save her life. Her journey began when she had a miscarriage in her 5th month of pregnancy.
In the middle of the night, about 1 o'clock in the morning, I woke up with severe abdominal pain and chills and a fever. I took my temperature and it was 106 at that point. Called my obstetrician to let him know what was happening, and he said to get right back to the emergency department where I worked. By then, my temperature was 107. The nurse showed the thermometer to me and asked, was it this high at home? And by then I was starting to have an irregular heartbeat. My blood pressure was starting to drop. I could feel a great deal of pain, and the fever was just going higher by the minutes. I didn't really think that I would die or even come close to it. But I could hear the monitor that I was attached to, and I could feel the irregularity of my heartbeat. And the nurse on my left-hand side tried to get my blood pressure. And she said, I can't get it. He tried to get it. And as he was pumping up my blood pressure, there was a very petite nursing assistant who kept trying to wipe me down, get my fever down.
I know what to do, sweetheart. Hang in there.
The resident on the right kept trying to get my blood pressure. And then he said, "Shit!" He said this bad word, and at that moment, I was different. Instead of laying down, looking up at them hovering over me, I was watching them from a position up high. I could hear everything that they were saying, and I could hear it crystal clear. I could understand not only what everybody was saying and what they were doing, but I could also feel what they were feeling. And this had me most concerned because my buddies were frantic. I was trying to get them to calm down. As odd as that sounds, I didn't want them to be upset. All of that pain, all of that suffering was completely gone. And there I was watching them, and the one little nursing assistant kept trying to wipe me down, and the one young physician gave her a shove. And I remember feeling very upset about that, but I knew then that something had happened. And with that moment of realizing that I couldn't talk to them, I couldn't communicate with them, and I couldn't calm them down, I was out of that room. And I was in some type of an enclosure. I could hear a sound like wind or like music or muffled voices, and I had a sense of moving quicker into more of a fullness, more of a sense of celebration. And I wanted even more so to get to this light that was up ahead. It was pure. It was perfect. And what was ahead was somewhere that I wanted to be.
One of the most powerful and life-altering parts of the near-death experience is being in the light and encountering divine beings. The Bible relates many instances of man communing directly with God or with an angelic representative of God. As when Mary was visited by the angel of the Lord and informed that she was to give birth to Jesus. In more recent years, visitors to the world beyond often refer to the divine beings they encounter as simply beings of light. There are visions that stay with a person the rest of his or her life.
When I came through the end of the tunnel, there was a bright, brilliant, beautiful light. A light so bright and so brilliant that I've never seen anything like it or felt anything like it. It penetrated me. It was as though I became a part of it and it became a part of me. As I looked to my right, I saw a being. Then this being started to move toward me. And how this communication was, it was as though I became the being and the being became me. We blended into each other.
I kind of felt somebody there waiting for me. And when I finally saw who this was, I can't say at this time that I ever knew who she was prior to this, but she loved me like nobody ever has. She just radiated love. And when she spoke to me, I could hear her thoughts in my mind instantly as she spoke them. And when she asked a question, she didn't ask one question. Inside each question were thousands of other questions, all separate, all different. And inside all those thousands of questions were other questions, all separate, all different. And I answered them all at the same time, and I couldn't even figure out how I could do that.
Who is the being of light? As Melvin Morse put it earlier, we each have a different conversation with God. Some refer to being in the presence of Jesus. Some prefer to call him Allah. Some are greeted by a guardian angel. But many are convinced that they were in the presence of God.
Without a doubt, what was on the other side of that barrier that I could not get past was God. In my mind, no, I don't even want to say in my mind, in my soul, or whatever part of that is deep inside, that's who was there. That is the God that I always hoped to believe in, but now I know is there.
I lost all sense of any body that I had, and I was pure consciousness in the light, and I absolutely knew the light was God. It was overwhelming.
Well, as a pediatrician who's interviewed children who have seen this God, let me hear you the kinds of things they describe it as. One boy told me that he saw a wizard dressed in white, and this wizard said to him, "Struggle and you shall live." That's a boy who's crazy about Nintendo. Another boy described to me that heaven was a pup tent in a golden field. A third child told me that he didn't go down a tunnel, he went through a huge noodle. I don't think anybody feels those images conflict with their personal beliefs. I don't think anyone can be struck by such images and not be convinced that something important spiritually is happening to children when they die.
It's my impression that people may use words drawn from their religious background and terminology, but that universally people describe the characteristics of this being of light as the same. A presence of complete love and compassion and understanding and wisdom.
Another life-transformational impression made on visitors to the other side is that it was a familiar place. They were being welcomed home, and the welcoming included becoming part of the light.
It was the beginning and the end of everything. It was the source. It felt like home. So there was a kind of a memory or a kind of a recall that this was familiar to me and I was familiar to my God, you know, that I was coming back.
That was the feeling. Very comfortable. I was surrounded with love. And I belonged there. I recognized the place. I was in a familiar place. Like I woke up of my dream and I'm home. That's it.
This light didn't hurt my eyes like the flash of the lightning bolt. It penetrated me. It was as though I became a part of it and it became a part of me.
That word being of light is almost too limiting. The light had a source, yet it was everything. It was like being part of this composite whole that was up ahead. This light was so full of every imaginable desire or feeling that you could ever have, and that was what I was attracted to. That's where I wanted to go.
This concept of our having a spiritual connection to God keeps coming up over and over again. Dr. Larry Darcy suggests that some aspect of us is divine. Daniel Brinkley maintains that we are all great and powerful spiritual beings. Grace Baboka speaks of being part of the light. Dr. Melvin Morse, who doesn't even profess to being religious, is convinced this connection is real and that we can see evidence of it in things that appear to be mere coincidence. He drew this conclusion after receiving an answer to an experimental prayer.
I once tried to pray as a little experiment, because a beautiful woman I know had told me that I should try it. And she's deeply religious and I'm not. So I said, alrighty, I'll try it. And she told me I should get down on my knees and just silently ask God a question. So, okay, I did it. And I felt really silly about it. And that lasted about 3 minutes. And I said, I would like to know what the relationship, this is my question, the relationship of man to God. And later that day, I suddenly had a blinding flash of spiritual intuition about a mathematical concept I've been trying to understand called fractals. And fractals are a mathematical concept which state that a piece of the whole is the same as the whole. For example, a snowflake. Now, you see the shape of a snowflake. If you look at a piece of that snowflake, you see the same shape replicated. If you look at a piece of the piece, you see the same pattern again. And suddenly, it came to me, maybe that's it. We as men are just a fractal of God.
We're all a part of each other in some way, like a woven garment, like a linen cloth woven into thread by thread, running in different directions and bisecting and crossing each other.
But for someone, some other person, that's going to be meaningless. Fractals, they're going to go, what the heck are fractals? You know, and I learned something about faith from this experience as well, because the first thing that happened to me after I had this insight was I thought, oh, this is just some kind of weird coincidence.
It's like this huge quilt that has no end on either side, top, bottom, right, left, front, or back, and every patch of that quilt matters.
I've been studying fractals for years, and I've been struggling in my mind of how to, you know, understand them, and it probably just was a coincidence that that day it suddenly all came together to me. But I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure that was a coincidence.
And I just see us all as being one big soul. We're part of this gigantic soul. God, love, whatever, however a person feels comfortable. And each one of us has something to do or to give and to make that love happen.
You know, if you read Parting Visions, that's the one thing I've learned from listening to the near-death experiences of children, is I have the absolute conviction now that the patterns of life are often revealed in so-called coincidence. And the reason that I've reached that, admittedly speculative leap, is from the simple fact that I've seen the healing that paying attention to so-called coincidence can bring in people's lives. And that is a healing that I have not seen in any other arena.
All those privileged to have stood in the presence of the being of light speak of being bathed in the most complete, most profound, most compassionate, and unconditional love they have ever known. The overwhelming message brought back by those who have had this experience is love one another.
And that's the way I feel. I feel totally different. I keep thinking, have I done enough? Was I kind enough to that person?
Who is God? God is love. It meant nothing. It was two separate things to me because of the way it was presented. But now I know it's the same thing.
The love that's there on the other side has no limits. It has ultimate depth. It has complete forgiveness. It has complete understanding.
And that love, you just can't even describe it. I call it unconditional love.
And that bright, shining love, that love that loves without qualifications, the way you'd accept your newborn baby, the way you'd accept your husband on the altar, complete, no strings attached love is close to the idea of what's on the other side.
Almost uniformly, these people talk about a deep sense of compassion, of caring, of empathy, of love, of oneness and unity that is experienced in the near-death phenomenon. And so I think these people are tapping into something that we demonstrated in the laboratory in the prayer experiments, the unifying power of love.
In my experience, that pure love, that superhuman love that has no boundaries and is all-powerful is what is connecting all of this.
I think we are arriving at a concept that love is some sort of glue that connects creatures, that connects living things at a distance. It is a power, it is a force, if you will, that can bring about distant happenings for the better. I don't think it's any exaggeration to say that we have empirical evidence for the life-changing, world-changing power of love.
A good example of how a personal encounter with this divine love can bring about a positive life transformation is the case of Diane Morrissey. Diane is a classically trained musician. Prior to her near-death experience, she played clarinet with a symphony orchestra. Classical music was her life. By her own admission, she was something of a snob about it, looking down her nose at anyone who listened to any other kind of music, other than classical, of course. As a result of her brush with death, she's had a complete attitude reversal. She changed her career, gave up playing classical music. She's now a more caring and compassionate person. In fact, she devotes much of her time to helping others.
So maybe somebody else.
In her role as support group leader for IONS, she helps people put their near-death experience into perspective as they embark on the rest of their lives.
Here's how Diane had her conversation with God.
I was getting ready to have a great big party in my home. I invited a lot of people, and I wanted everything to look really nice, so I cleaned my fish tank. And in the process of assembling it, evidently I did it incorrectly. When I passed the den door, I noticed there was a big puddle underneath the fish tank.
What Diane didn't realize was that the water carried a deadly charge of electricity.
When I went to pick it up, the tubing flipped water across my cheek. And I looked down and I thought, the very last thought in my head, wow, I shouldn't have touched that. I was at the ceiling and I noticed my dog was trying to wake my physical body up on the floor. And I thought, good boy, you know, he's trying to wake me up. I looked toward the kitchen and could see the telephone and instantly knew I should call for help. So I went straight through the walls like they weren't even there. And when I went to pick the telephone up with my right hand, my hand went through it. I walked around the house for a time and I stopped one moment in the living room and looked down and was real surprised to see my legs through the top of the glass coffee table. I tried to save me at the beginning, but as I stayed in the experience, it mattered less and less whether I saved me. And Diane Morrissey just wasn't as important as I was at the beginning of the experience. I didn't know how to get back in my body, but I wasn't frightened that I couldn't. And the last thing I said, and I just couldn't believe it, I said, how sad she's done so very little. And I thought I had a really full life that counted for lots of good things that I did for people. But I knew in my heart I never really touched anybody. At about that time, I went right through the tunnel, right at the dim windows.
Many of those individuals who have had a complete near-death experience report the one aspect of it that had the most profound life transformational effect was the life review. They've had an opportunity to review their life accomplishments and their mistakes and see how their actions affected others. The Scottish poet Robert Burns, in one of his poems, reflected on how great a gift from God it would be to see ourselves as others see us. During a life review, we will.
It's important for all of us to listen to this part and take it very deeply. Not only will you be and see everything you've ever done, you will become the people that you have encountered, and thereby feeling how they feel about you.
I could not pass into that light that I was so attracted to. And at that barrier is probably the most meaningful part of this whole experience, because at that stopping point, I saw everything in my life that I ever did or saw or felt or thought that I hid from others or myself, and yet it was all understood. Everything in my life that you could put a good label on or a bad label on was there for not only me to see, but all others in that light I saw my whole life unfold, and I was having insight into what my life was about.
I was able to deal with it because I wasn't just Daniel Brinkley. I had begun to peel away the ego self and begun to be what we truly are, powerful spiritual beings.
And I was held accountable for my life. I felt how others felt when I acted a certain way. I experienced their feelings.
What I think the experience did for me was it made me more aware of others.
In absolute love, I was being given an understanding that I never had before.
I was always real fortunate. I came from a wonderful home, had a wonderful childhood. My parents loved me desperately. And their love, you just, compared to this woman, you can't even compare it. When she came, she stood next to me, and she extended her hand outward, and she said, "Look there." And when I turned my head, I saw from the moment I was born, and I watched every second of my life from the moment I was born until I died. And it wasn't just seeing it, I lived it again, exactly the way I felt it the first time, but with a new sense of kind of intellectual understanding about how I could have done it different, what might have been better, and other things that I cared little about, that I didn't think made an impression on anybody's life at all, were very significant. And probably the most important was when I worked at a convalescent hospital in high school, after school. And I used to give a lady graham crackers and milk before I'd leave the shift. And I had no idea how much I had changed her life, how grateful, how appreciative she was. And I thought it was so insignificant back at that time in the 11th grade, but it wasn't. It was like every spirit looking down and saying, "Thank you for doing this. This woman had nobody. No one loved her."
As a nurse, I was always very proud of how technically proficient I was. If you were having a heart attack and you came into my emergency department, you would have your vitals done immediately.
Nurse, I'm so scared.
I was missing the value of my role. Coming back with that lesson didn't necessarily slow me down, but when I put in my next IV, I held that person's hand. And I would find a way that someone could stay with them while I gave report, or that I would just take more care in what I did.
I not only felt every emotion I'd ever felt, I saw everything I had ever done. But more than that, and probably more important than anything else, I became every person I'd ever encountered in my life.
I don't understand why you're so upset
Financial
about this
matters
little...
take two people. Do you think this is a money tree? It's a lemon tree.
I kept waiting to be judged.
It's just
And
like
then I
that.
realized it was me
Here's the
judging
check.
me.
Take it or leave
You know,
it, okay?
people say, "Oh, well, that's not so bad."
200. I want.
Well, the only way I can relate it is, have you ever had a bad hair day times 10 million? That's how you're going to look at yourself. That's how you're going to focus on yourself, and that no one can judge you more harshly than you can. No one.
Daniel Brinkley's near-death experience is one of the most complete ever reported. His resuscitation efforts stopped. His body was put aside, waiting to be transported to the morgue. He was dead a total of 28 minutes. After his life review, he was given a tour of that other world that most haven't seen.
We began to move. We began to move upward as though we were soaring. We kept moving higher and higher and higher, and I could see what appeared to me as lights emanating outward from the buildings. They were like great tabernacles, like great cathedrals, great buildings. When I think about it, I can only relate it like great cathedrals, like the cathedrals of Notre Dame and the great Gothic cathedrals of Europe. I'm not saying that they were churches, but I have seen such great, beautiful cathedrals built in honor of God that I think my mind would relate it that way. They were buildings that looked like they were glass brick. And as we moved into the building, I could feel a certain resistance. I didn't go through a doorway, I just passed into it. But as I also was passing into this building, I became aware that I had the ability to consume, understand, and know all information and all knowledge at the same time, from the very first molecule of a flower to the entire beauty of the plant. I was given insight into how to give love and share love again. It was pretty amazing to me, all this stuff. And as I've thought through it over the last 19 years, it's still quite amazing. But nonetheless, this happened. Then this being said, I had to return. What had been happening to me in the meantime, they had rushed me to the hospital. They had been working on me in the hospital. They got me restabilized, and I was breathing for a few minutes. Then they lost me for 11 more minutes. They had worked on me. They tired themselves out. They finally gave up. They covered me. They put a sheet over my head. They rolled me out into a room, waiting for me to be taken to the morgue. I all of a sudden appear in this hospital. I'm floating above everything, looking around. In this room, I saw a guy with a sheet over his head, a body. I knew it was me. All of a sudden, I'm back in my body. I'm on fire again. I'm burning. I'm going through all the sensations of not being able to put my conscious thoughts together because of the intense pain. My tongue is swollen completely the size of my mouth. I can't talk. There's nothing that I could do. So I'm looking up. What do? I realized they were coming to take me to the morgue. And all I knew to do was to blow the sheet.
Hey, this guy's still alive.
I spent the next 7 months learning to walk again, learning to feed myself again, falling against the walls, blacking out.
Dannion Brinkley was back among the living, at least for a while.
14 years after the first near-death experience, I had my second in the series of conversations with God.
Ever since Dannion's electrocution, he'd been living with a weak heart. The doctors told him that unless he had immediate open-heart surgery, he would die.
I knew what he was telling me was that the damage done by the lightning some 14 years ago, the hard work I had put in and pushing myself through these 14 years, and the aortic valve, which had developed staph infection, was giving away and I was drowning in my own blood. So I was pretty happy because I knew there was no way I could live through that without having the surgery, and I wasn't having the surgery.
I had known Dan for some years, about 10 or 12 years at least. I got a call from a friend of his that he was dying.
I had resigned myself, talked to my family, got them together, put my business in order, and my father and my friend Franklin had thought of Raymond, Dr. Moody, and they called him.
I walked in, and I was quite startled to see Dan lying on the bed, unable to sit up. He was so weak. His color is just unimaginable. No one could get a real sense of this. It's impossible to believe. I've never seen anybody that color who lived to tell about it, let's say that. Dark gray purple.
And people say, don't you think that you would miss the things that were here? Not in the least bit. I wouldn't.
And I said, Dan, is there anything I can do for you?
And I said, yes, Raymond. I want a roast beef sandwich with lots of horseradish on it because I want to go out of here on a cholesterol rush. And we both laughed.
I said, please, Dan, sign it for me. And at this point, the first time I'd really seen him upset, he said, all right, damn it, I'll sign it. Got mad, crashed his hand down on this table they had rolled across, signed it. They whisked him right away into the operating room.
I knew there was no way, even after promising Raymond, I knew there was no way I could live through them taking my heart out and cutting it. I think that one of the greatest things that I've learned in all of this is in my second near-death experience doing open-heart surgery. I had the same panoramic life review. I saw the first 25 years through the same way as I saw it, but then, by the grace of God, I saw the next 14 years. Instead of being the people I'd hurt, humiliated, and caused such trouble and trauma in their life, I became the people who I had helped face death.
Those who have talked with God also tell of being admonished to use their life to learn, to devour knowledge. Most of those who have come back do just that. They look at life with a different perspective. They see beauty where they could see none before. They see the wonder in the world. They treat others with more compassion.
There's no question but that people who go through this kind of experience are transformed in a direction in which they place a lot more value and emphasis upon human relationships.
If we could only pretend to be colorblind, to accept our differences as wonderful, I just feel like this could be such a better world without fighting over our differences instead of appreciating our differences.
I would say that there is also a marked tendency for them to be people who live very much in the present and can really be there, not really distracted about what's going to happen tomorrow. Living in the presence and sense of humor, again, is something I've seen time and time again with them.
You know, if someone saw me right after my near-death experience or a few years later, they wouldn't look at me and say, Grace is really different. They wouldn't notice an outside visible change, but I think people that know me well will realize the depth of change, the shift of perspective, the caring, the quality, the time, noticing things that I've never noticed before. It brings to mind the phrase, stopping to smell the roses, stopping to listen and to hear and to feel and appreciate all that's in this life. It changed me so deeply that it just was overwhelming at first. It seemed like I couldn't read enough, I couldn't listen enough. Again, I keep going back to people, people that I talked with. I could not get enough of them. I wanted to know more about them.
I know a woman who was 66 years of age, who had graduated some years before from high school. She had a cardiac arrest, was in the hospital for a time. 2 weeks after she got out of the hospital, she went down to the local junior college and signed up for courses.
So now, after 19 years, I've been a hospice volunteer for 17 years. I've been a nursing home volunteer for 12 years. How we affect things in our life is, you know, when you're a kid, how you skip stones or you throw a stone into a still pond, and then you watch the ripples. Every thought that you have, every action that you have has that same effect.
You know, in all the books I've written about near-death experience, one truth really stands out, and that is that religion is very much like working for the federal government, and being spiritual is very much like being an American. And the analogy here is that people who have near-death experiences frequently quit being religious and become far more spiritual.
All spiritual intuitions and feelings are equally valid, and that's why I've emphasized again and again that one person who has a spiritual feeling that causes him to have a knot in his stomach is the same thing as another person who just feels a whisper in the ear, I love you.
And I felt my mother's presence coming to me. It was very eerie and kind of, I don't know, just kind of cold but eerie, but very spiritual, very loving. And I felt like her hand was taking and going like this to me, because that's what I was doing to her while she was in the coma.
I love you. Thank you for taking care of me. I'm okay now.
Well, also the neat thing about the life review is that you can have it without being almost dead.
Absolutely.
I mean, you can have a life review on a daily basis, and you can make changes in your life just as if you had a near-death experience.
Apart from having a positive life transformation, individuals who have had near-death experiences find that they are different in other ways as well. For example, 25% of near-death experiences can't wear wristwatches. They stop. Give the wristwatch to someone who hasn't had an experience, it works. Put it back on the near-death experience's wrist, it stops. So far, there's no explanation. Some find that their minds are open to new knowledge in profound ways, miraculously given insights into mathematics or physics. Some have even been given psychic abilities, having a newfound clairvoyance or extrasensory perception.
How can it be that someone has a near-death experience and is so altered by that experience that suddenly they have dreams that come true? That sounds extraordinary. That sounds non-scientific. That sounds like nonsense, as many of my friends would say. And yet, the Southwest SIDS Alliance, the nation's largest research group on the effects of sudden infant death, have documented that 25% of parents who have infants die of SIDS have such a spiritual vision or intuition before the child dies. Now that we understand the function of our right temporal lobe, we understand how such a thing can be possible.
The idea that you could heal at a distance has been regarded as silly. Well, it's not as silly as it might sound. This has actually been put to the test.
And so, again, for the first time, we now have a coherent theory in which someone who's had a near-death experience has their right temporal lobe activated, and they're left with the residual ability to use that area of the brain to see future events. Why not? You know, it makes perfect sense from, interestingly enough, from a rational and scientific viewpoint, it makes sense.
We have empirical, solid scientific evidence that distant so-called psychic healing is not just fantasy anymore, but a concept that can be scientifically validated.
We see that there's a range of ways it presents to each person depending on their own spiritual outlooks and, let's face it, the development of their right temporal lobes. For some people who have well-developed temporal lobes, right temporal lobes, they see an angel in white. For people like myself or my friend who are right temporal lobe impaired, we need a kick in the stomach.
I think there's a point where we simply acknowledge that our visions and our experiences, as deep and transformative as they may be, at some point are simply beyond words. I'm touched by that feeling.
We're on the threshold of a new era of understanding. These near-death experiences are opening our eyes to a new reality. And these dramatic life transformations we see are striking evidence of the power of this reality. If we listen with an open mind, we may learn some valuable lessons.
The concept that people can see angels, that human beings have a soul that is separate from the body, those are considered to be naive beliefs from a simpler, more primitive time. Science is our God.
The question is it all over with the death of the brain and the body? When my brain and body die and rot, is there anything left over? Is there anything more? I believe that on the basis of modern scientific empirical findings, we can give a yes answer to that.
I think that two forces have shaped our current spiritual impoverishment as a society. The first one is our philosophical concepts that something must be proven in order to be rational. And that somehow then quickly got twisted into it's irrational to believe in something you can't prove.
Science changes funeral by funeral. And I'm convinced that that's one of the ways that we will achieve newer insights.
The second part of that comes from religion itself. Religion, feeling the assault of science, particularly in the late 1800s, then took a tact that all religious experience is direct revelation from God, and in doing so they felt that they could shelter themselves from any kind of skeptical inquiry. But as a result then, we became very fractured from a spiritual standpoint.
And so I think that modern medicine will be drugged, kicking and screaming, into acknowledging that there are new concepts of consciousness in which we say that the mind goes beyond the individual brain and the body.
If it is true, and I think that the scientific evidence points towards this being true, if it's true that we can access some sort of God that exists independent of our biological bodies, then clearly we're able to access a timeless place, because time is only a function of man as a biological being.
I've never met someone who had a powerful near-death experience who came back not believing in a God or accepting that there is a God.
You can't be in the light and be the same person ever again. You just can't.
If I had my choice, I would have stayed.
We have to start to now understand that all of these are part of one shared spiritual fabric. And it's interesting to me that science is leading the way. It's science that's allowing for people to have so many near-death experiences, which have led to these wonderful spiritual insights, in my case, learned from children. And I think it's this new scientific understanding of the brain, which is letting us know, hey, wait a minute, we are spiritual beings.
As Dr. Raymond Moody pointed out earlier, we may not be able to scientifically prove life after death from these experiences, but we can prove that these experiences have a profound and positive life transformational effect. Now, if we could only learn from this, all of us, if we could have a life transformation of our own without nearly dying, and practice compassion and love of our fellow man, it would be a better world, wouldn't it?